The Sound Off Podcast. The show about podcast and broadcast. Starts now.
Last week on the show, I said that Alberta is the podcast capital of Canada. Am I right?
Oh, I don't know. There definitely is individuals that live in Calgary that are very influential within the podcast world, but I didn't know about them until a year or two ago. And so from my seat as an ad person, Calgary was not on the map of podcasting to me. But there were creators that existed here, and there were creators that have come out of Calgary. But I always saw either Toronto or Vancouver as the capital of podcasting within Canada, because in Vancouver, there was at least Podcast Nation that was based out of there. Some of the Quill team is out of there. And so there were these big entities that I knew from the advertising world of podcasting that existed there. In Toronto, I knew, your Bob Kanes, and that's where you would find typically your Acast people or your Libsyn people at the time, or anyone that was like a larger industry seller. So I only saw those two as like the hubs of Canadian podcasting. And that was until I met Tim Truax. And Tim, he found me. I can't remember who introduced us, but eventually we got introduced, and he said, "Hey, can I take you out for lunch or dinner or whatever it was after work day?" We sat down, myself and one of my colleagues with him, and he's like, "Hey, I think I want you to speak at Pod Summit, because we don't have anyone to talk about the ad side of the industry, and I think a lot of creators would love to know how monetization on podcasting works." And so sure enough, I realized there was a bit of a community here. I met Jeff Humphreys, who runs a studio now in the city, and Meg Wilcox, who I think is the only PhD in podcasting that currently exists, like a dedicated PhD in podcasting. And they're based here in Calgary. So there are some like very educated, incredibly talented people that are stupidly smart around podcasting that live here in Calgary. I just didn't know it existed until last Pod Summit.
Yeah, always go to those podcast meetups. You never know who you're going to meet, and you'll find out that the community is a little more vibrant than you think. And also you jarred, I think of Toronto Mike, who's been doing podcasting for many years, and Canada Land as well, who we can add to that list. Why should brands be excited about podcast advertising?
Well, I'll tell you why I'm excited about it. I got my start in podcasting both as a creator and then also while I was working at a company called Fume. They're an e-commerce startup out of Calgary. They make a no smoke, no vape, no nicotine replacement for the hand-to-mouth habit of smoking and vaping to help people quit and transition their habit off of nicotine. And we had a lot of trouble getting our ads onto Meta or Google, etc. Come 2021, we were like 3 months runway left in our business cash flow before we were going to have to close our doors and say, this just isn't working because we can't get the word out about what our product is and who it's for. A podcast network reached out to us. They said, "Hey, we had another smoking cessation product on our network that did well. They're no longer advertising with us. Would you guys be interested in advertising on our network?" And gratefully and thankfully, I had a very optimistic manager. My CMO was like, "We'll do anything. We'll try anything, because we either die trying or we're dying not trying. So do something and just take a risk." So we spent $5,000 on podcast ads, and immediately we got, I think, 10 grand or 15 grand back. It was an immediate return on investment that came back quite quickly. And this was like early days of great podcast advertising where you could almost like throw money at the wall and most of it would stick. And that kickstarted my career in podcast ads. Simultaneously, I was also running my own podcast. And I think I've probably shared this publicly somewhere. I was working for a startup in Calgary. I wasn't making very much money. So I was always looking for a side hustle to help pay the bills. And so I had my podcast that I accidentally launched. And sure enough, I ended up stumbling into some revenue models there. I was selling my own merch. I had an event that I was running and had an advertiser on there, and was making an additional $30-some thousand a year off of that, which made it so that I had a somewhat reasonable life in Calgary.
So there was success early in 2021, with this product and getting it into the ears of people. So think back to that period. What were some of the techniques that were used to really, match the brand with the podcast? Because I'm sure that's evolved and changed since then.
I think I'm the luckiest person in podcast ads, because in hindsight, once I've done, I've booked thousands and thousands of shows now. And if I were to go back on my success rate on the shows that I've picked for my brands that have gone on to be profitable and long-term good performers for the clients that I work with, if I'm hitting above 30 to 40% of the time, that's a really good ratio. And the reason that is because you find 30% that work, you book those in for a year, they cover the cost of the ones that aren't working, and you keep rinsing and repeating, and you keep finding new opportunities and new shows to go with. I had no strategy when I launched. It was, we had someone that came to us at the right time with the right opportunity. I said yes. And it candidly, in hindsight, it was the right shows. It was the right audiences. It met all the metrics that I would look at now as a media buyer to qualify the shows as being good shows. I didn't have that. So like genuinely, I think I got very lucky with the first 2 shows that I booked. And along the way, I found shows that didn't perform. And that's when I started to have to build up my toolkit of, okay, so why didn't that work? And why did this one work? Oh, there's really good long-term advertisers on this show, and this show can't seem to keep an advertiser happy for more than 2 months in a row. And they were falling off and dropping off. That was probably one of the first learnings that I ever had, was follow brands where they're seeing long-term sustained success. And we would do that by just looking at that time, before there were tools like Podscribe or like Magellan, et cetera, that I had access to, I would just like look at the show, follow it a little bit, and see that Sheath Underwear was advertising every 3 episodes on this show for a year straight. And I'd go, Sheath Underwear, male audience, mid-30s, tends to perform on the same shows that I've been performing on. Let me just find where else Sheath or Ridge Wallet or Blue Chew or some of these other brands that were targeting like a male 30 plus audience were consistently advertising. And then I went after those. And that was like my initial strategy at Fume.
So you asked me before we started what my favorite podcast was, and I'm sure a lot of people would answer that question and just say, well, it's the one with the most downloads. But I find that the shows with the most downloads are actually the most difficult to manage. For whatever reason, maybe it just sometimes feels that products get on there and the subject matter is too wide. So when we go back to that sort of how do we match this up, is there a sweet spot that you look for that doesn't involve the downloads metric inside a show?
Yeah, totally. The way that I teach our media buying team at Adopter Media now is to follow a 5-step framework of vetting for a show. And it's always going to begin with, first, take a look at the renewal history of that show. When we sign on a show to work with a brand and to advertise, I like to set the framework of, we're hiring an employee to work for that brand. And so we want to look at their resume. We want to say, okay, well, have they worked with other brands like our brand in past? It's not necessarily an indicator that it won't work, but it can be an indicator that they have some past experience selling products similar to ours with sustained long-term success. So vetting, number 1, look at the renewal history. It's like their report card or their resume of job history. Number 2, we would look at an indicator that would be more like demographically aligned. And we'd say, okay, so is the show good at keeping brands around? Yep. Okay, now does it fit the general demographics of what we'd be looking for? That could be inferred. Sometimes you can just look at a podcast and get a pretty good idea of what the content and the audience is likely going to be. I encourage my team to lean into like general stereotypes, because oftentimes you're going to be mostly right about what the audience is based on the content. If it's 2 girlfriends sitting on the couch talking about their dating history and their dating life, and they're in their early to mid 20s, the likelihood is their audience is also going to be in that category. You don't necessarily need to reach out to the show always and ask them for what's your demographics, all these things. For example, there's a show called Over 50 and Flourishing. It's hosted on Studio 71. Do you think that most of that audience is going to be young men in their 20s to 30s?
No.
Unlikely, I would hope. Maybe not. Maybe there's some really young men who are really trying to look after their aging mothers or grandmothers, or who knows. So anyways, lean into the demographic data, find a good alignment. Just check that box off. Is it generally aligned with you? Cool. 3, we'd look at something like an engagement ratio. That's taking some of the data that we would pull from the iTunes reviews that a show has. There's a general multiplier that will apply, like a 20x multiplier on iTunes reviews versus what the show's reported downloads are. We'd look at those 2 things side by side and then say, okay, are we projecting a bigger audience than what the audience actually is? That's going to lead to a positive engagement ratio. If it's less than what they're telling us the audience is, it's a less than engaged audience. It's not a hard and fast, this is the way, but it can be a helpful indicator to find a show that could be great to work with. And then lastly, we would look at stuff like the ad load and ad efficacy of the show. And so I would encourage my team to look at how many ads do they do in an episode? How do they insert their ads into the episodes? And how do they actually sound when they do the ad read? When you do all 4 of those steps, it gives you a really good framework for getting to step 5, which is negotiating. every show will work for a brand at a certain price point. Now, that price point might not be a price point that the creator wants, but we can kind of, through that process, deduce what seems to be a reasonable price for that brand by checking off all those boxes. So I might encourage my team, if I'm buying for Fume, let's say their ideal demographic now is a 20 to 30-year-old female show. We found a show, great renewal history. That's a checkbox. That's a if you're familiar with the concept of card counting and blackjack, that's a +1 in the head right now. So I'm willing to tolerate a higher CPM. Then I might go to the demographics. It's actually a male-leaning show, so that's a -1 in my head. But it doesn't mean it's a hard no. It could still work, but I'm losing a little bit of my value on the show. I'd go down to the way that they do their ads and engagement ratio, and maybe those both look pretty good. So the only thing that's detracting is that it's not the right demographic. It's a male-leaning show, but everything else looks great. I still might take a test on it. I just might push the rate down just a little bit to say, hey, it's not perfectly aligned for my brand. If you think this is a good fit for you and you're willing to take the risk with me, I'm happy to do this, but this would be the rate that would make sense. And so that's how I teach my team to buy.
So one of the things that sort of glazed past my ear was taking a look at ratings and reviews. We know it doesn't have anything to do with the discoverability necessarily of your show, but I think for people, I've seen this in the PR world, and you sort of touched on it a bit, that it does show activity for a show. You can still be a successful podcast and have zero activity on rate and review, but just seeing it there just is a small indication that there's activity, correct?
Yeah, and more than that, it's a disqualifier for me. That's where I use it probably more than as a qualifier. For example, I'll tell you a story of a show that got the better of me for a long time, and it got the better of a lot of our industry. I won't name the show. There's still a show that exists, and they still have found a way to take advantage of unsuspecting brands. But there's a show, massive YouTube following. They get about 100,000, almost always 100,000 views per episode that they get. They bill out at 100,000. They've been doing this for years. When we measure the performance of this show by coupon codes, it looks amazing. Every time we would do a buy on the show, coupon codes through the roof. People were ordering product. We were so excited. It was like a 5x return on ad spend. Anything a CMO would praise and be excited about. But eventually I started to go, I think this is too good to be true. I think something here isn't really adding up. And so this is where I started to learn other ways of doing attribution. And so we installed post-purchase surveys onto the brand's site. And I've been advertising on this show for months. Not a single mention ever came in for this show. And it had hundreds of thousands of people listening in. We got hundreds and hundreds of orders via coupon codes. I would get shows that might only get one coupon code mention with like 2 survey mentions. This show had hundreds of coupon codes, no survey mentions. Then we went to the show. We looked at its YouTube audience, the 100,000 views per episode. And you go to any video, 0 comments, 1 comment, nothing. And similar to how we look at the iTunes side of things, a show might tell us, oh, we get 100,000 downloads an episode, but they only have 2 reviews on iTunes. It just seems unreasonable to me that 100,000 people tune in weekly and only 2 of those 100,000 people ever came through and left a review. Something's a little fishy to me. And so I use that more as a disqualifier to say, if these engagement ratios are so off, that's a telltale sign that either it's a likely purchased audience, likely very not engaged, but it could also be that the show is brand new. And the show might be brand new. They don't have a big following yet. They haven't earned that longevity where people start to review it. That's where I would say with my team, it's like, you can't use that formula for a new show. It just doesn't make sense.
So let's stick with the 100,000 downloads for a second. It's a very random number and largely doesn't apply to most of us. But 100,000 downloads does not mean 100,000 people listen to the podcast ad. Correct. There are moments when, you just don't get over the hump, and over the hump means getting people to the mid-roll. Is it a guessing game for you to figure out, how engaged the audience is that they're actually getting through most of the show or to the end of the show to make sure that those ads are listened to?
Maybe a little bit. And this is where I think post rolls in general are kind of like not a desirable commodity, at least from a performance attribution.
They are not. That is where the promo goes. We're going to put the promo there. We're going to do promo swaps.
Sell your own stuff in your post rolls, but I think brands that are getting those spots are getting a severe disadvantage, and it's just not likely to ever work for them at any reasonable rate. So we don't have from our end, like from an advertiser perspective, when I sponsor your show, unless you show me your listen through data on your show, I have no visibility tool to know if people got to my mid roll. You tell me, and I have tools if we pixel your show to see how many downloads your show got, or how many downloads of the episode that had our ad in it, or the episodes if it's a run of network or a DAI campaign, etc. has. But I don't know how many people truly listen to your ad in the episode. There are tools and technology that are coming, and certain platforms are now offering this. And theoretically, if you pass through to us or to Podscribe, your Apple Connect, I believe it's called, then they can see the listen data as opposed to the download data and parse that out and say, well, you got 100,000 downloads, but only 50,000 of them made it to your point in the episode with the mid-roll that you were in. I don't think the industry wants to go that direction by passing everything through, because it will unveil a lot of secrets about a lot of shows that don't have very good engaged audiences, and they get a 70% drop off in the first 15 minutes of their show every time. I don't think the industry wants that data out there yet. I don't think they're comfortable with it. But the one company, love them or hate them, that is starting to push and lead that charge is Spotify. They've been a champion of their streaming ad insertion technology. They've been pushing that forward, especially with their pull to get everybody to opt into Spotify video and Spotify streaming. That has removed the ability to track on download, and it is now inserting the ads at the stream level, which is platform listening, and it is a live listening experience. So when they say you got 100,000 streams, they mean 100,000 people listen to your ad, which is a more technically accurate answer. And I think that that's something that the rest of the industry should be aware of, that they are setting a new precedent of they can tell you this is how many people listen to your ad, whereas everybody in the RSS world is saying this is how many people downloaded your ad. I don't know how many listened. It's something to be aware of. I think that's going to hit our industry as a more real reality within like 2 years.
Yeah, so a fun example that I have, there's a 90-minute show. The first mid-roll, we will probably get about 90% of, that 100,000 downloads reaching it. But we only got about 600, we only got about 60,000 on the second mid-roll, which is about, 50 minutes into the show, let's say. And so you can see it, the ad people know, and they said, this is not ringing, this is just not ringing through as much as the ad that ran in the first mid-roll.
There's hard data to support that too. So Podscribe, one of the leading companies in the attribution space, they do a quarterly report and they measure the effectiveness of mid-roll 1, mid-roll 2, mid-roll 3, 4, so on. And they'll show you the conversion rates and visit rates of each spot as it gets further in the episode. Now, you can make the argument it's because it's more ads. It's not necessarily because it's more ads. It's just further in the episode and less people are getting there. So it's inherently going to have less visitors and less conversions. But you could say ad load or ad episode length have a factor in that.
So you have access to a lot of data.
I do.
And
yes.
so I get to ask this question. What is something that is distinctly Canadian that you see about Canadian podcasts that is just different from the American ones? And I'm asking this because I know that in the States, I get my pod news from there. I get all my press releases from there. So I know what the industry is like, but what's something that's distinctly Canadian about the Canadian podcast advertising industry?
It's far less competitive. It's also far less optimized right now. So there are lots of great Canadian podcasts and podcasters. A majority of those podcasts and podcasters still have a majority of their audience based in the US. And so if I'm a brand and I want to buy Canadian impressions, there's not actually a large influx of impressions coming from Canadian hosted shows to Canadian audiences where they're a majority. So the ad buying methodology that exists in the States, which is still predominantly host-read episodic ads, doesn't really exist in Canada. In Canada, it's mostly DAI programmatic because they don't have a substantial enough volume of Canadian listeners per episode to make it reasonable to do an episodic target on a show. So the buying methodologies are very different, similar to the UK. The UK is quite alike to Canada in that regard. Secondly, what that means is, for implications, is that some of the sins of early DAI that were resolved in the States haven't necessarily been resolved effectively in the UK and Canada when it comes to like frequency capping issues or even just like general standards around performance-based advertising. Performance-based advertising is super, super critical to the American economy of podcast advertising. Canada and the UK, it's not. It's been mostly brand awareness and it's mostly been uncapped impressions, mostly been unfrequency capped as well. And so it's just buying boatloads of impressions to Canadians, hoping that it's doing something effective. I experienced this as a listener to podcasts, and you likely do as well. There's not as many brands that advertise in Canada and advertising to Canadians specifically. I used to listen to a show, and I still love this show. I listened to the whole first season of Dungeons and Daddies. I'm a D&D nerd. I love it. And for, I want to say, 14 episodes straight, I was getting in every episode the same ad for Cozy, the modular furniture company based out of Montreal. I love Cozy. Don't get me wrong. Like, they're a great brand, great product. I've thought about buying their stuff. Maybe the podcast influenced me, but the amount that they spent on impressions just for me is crazy because there was no frequency capping, nothing. And it's just not the way that Canada or the UK or most non-US countries have been set up to do their ads, because they were not indicted into podcast advertising by performance-based marketers that set the stage for how podcasting should be done for brands to get an ROI on their ads. Does that suffice as a general broad answer?
Yes, it certainly does. I will accept that answer, absolutely. But at the same time, when I mentioned what's the difference between Canada and the US, and we talked about that, you're an ad buyer and you've got all of Canada to deal with, and that would include 8 million francophones in Quebec. Mm-hmm. Do you deal with in the French language? And if you do, how is it different in Quebec?
I don't, and this is more out of naivety from my end. All my brands are generally 90% of my brands are US based. I have one in the UK, or two in Europe, one specifically in the UK. I have a couple Canadian companies that I've worked for, but they do 80+% of their revenue in the States, so they care about the US side of advertising more so than they care about Canada for e-commerce. And so to set the stage on my background is e-commerce. I work predominantly in direct-to-consumer e-commerce type brands. And Canada's e-commerce scene generally sucks. And this is where I'll slightly shit on. Can I say shit?
Absolutely.
Amazing.
Fuck that.
I'll shit on the Canadian postal system. It actually makes it really difficult for Canadian e-commerce to thrive. When I worked at Fume, to give you back end into how we used to do things, shipping to an American was cheaper than shipping to a Canadian, even though we were shipping from Canada. The way that we would do it is we would use a company called Montana Mailbox that would come with a little truck. They'd come to our warehouse in Chestermere, Alberta, or Chestermere, just outside of Calgary. They'd load up all of our supplies. They'd drive it across the border. It would be $1 per package that we'd pay for. And then they'd ship it using USPS in the States for $5 or $6 a package. So total cost for shipping, $7. Do you want to know how much it costs to ship something from Chestermere to Calgary? A 20-minute drive using the Canadian Postal Service.
No, I'm afraid.
It's like $20.
Yeah, I was going to say $21.
Yeah, it's like 15 to 20, depending on where you're going and so on and so on. That inherently is such a barrier to doing e-commerce, and it's slower, it's more expensive, and it's more prone to failures along the way. It is not a good postal system, and it means e-commerce generally doesn't do well within Canada. So most Canadian e-com brands find most of their success in the States, and as a byproduct, they advertise mostly in the States. And any kind of like halo effect of their US advertising, because as Canadians, we're so influenced by US-based advertising, they'll by proxy end up purchasing products. So we on average, we get like 10% of our efforts in the US impacting Canada.
Yeah, so every time you have to produce, I mean, you can run the same ad in the US as you will in Canada, but of course, if you have to go to Quebec to run it, you've got to go get new voice talent, you've got to go get new copy, you have to rewrite the entire marketing campaign for what is essentially a different country. I've seen it before, and of course, it's very, very difficult to scale, so I completely understand that.
Yeah, so in short, I don't have any experience doing the French language. We've never done any like nationwide advertising within Canada or to Quebec specifically.
So you mentioned this in Vegas. I believe it was a podcast movement where you were talking about the DAI bubble and, ads being inserted into RSS, based podcasts. That bubble was going to burst. I went to London and heard Dan Meisner talk about what are we going to do now with the download. And so where do we sit today?
Right now is probably one of the healthier seasons of podcasting in general. I think we're building up a bubble again, and I think it goes back to that download versus listen conversation that's starting to well up a little bit more, where brands are going to get savvier and realize, there is a gamification of podcasts where they could incentivize downloads and sell downloads through programmatic exchanges to fill their revenue buckets. But if they have to be accountable to the people actually listening to the ads in their episode, they're going to lose a lot of money. I think one of the first dominoes that started to tip in our industry that is going to lead us to that direction was specifically Janine Wright's Inception Point AI company. If listeners aren't familiar, this was ex-Wondery executive, that has gone on to launch a AI podcast studio startup in which they're publishing, I believe it's 3,000 podcast episodes a week. They're roughly producing at the cost of $1 an episode. And as long as they're able to get about 50 downloads per episode, it is a profitable engine for them where they can make money. Now, great, you think it's hard to get 50 downloads on an episode. Relatively speaking, it is. But there's also ways in which people have been able to gamify getting downloads on podcasts. If it's either through SEO searchability, web browser, you name it, there's lots of ways that people can get 50 to 100 downloads on an episode. Maybe less than ethical at times, in my opinion, though they may be legal. However, maybe I'm a pessimist on this, and I don't think the content of this podcast venture is probably very good. I could be wrong. Maybe the content's amazing and I should give more of it a listen. Listen to one episode and I was like, okay, I wouldn't probably listen to a full episode. I get the point of it. It's like quick education on something in the current events around whatever it is. I made it like a minute or two in, and say there's a mid-roll at minute 5, I'm dropping off. And similar to your point where we were talking about earlier, they can get downloads, but can they get people to listen through the episode? And if they can prove that people are listening through their content at a reasonable rate, I actually have less of an issue with it. But right now, they are monetizing through Spreaker, which allows you to monetize through programmatic impressions at a really, really low volume. There's no threshold for downloads that you need to be able to monetize there. And if they can gamify that their cost to get 50 downloads is less than what it will be for them to get a return, and they can fill it with 24 ad markers in an episode, yeah, that's going to take advantage of our ecosystem. Ads are going to show up in this content, and brands are going to lose a lot of money on this type of content. This is where I think that pivot to focusing on the listen will save us from ventures like this, because we'll then be able to prove, yeah, you're getting lots of downloads, but nobody's really listening.
Are you able to see that when something has been gamified? Because I can catch it by just saying, oh, that's a lot of browser traffic. Yep. And it's all coming from the same area.
Yeah, the web browser side of it, yes. So whenever we pixel a campaign, we get a lot of data on the back end via, say, Podscribe, or if you use Claritas or whatever, I'm sure it's all quite the same about what you can see on the back end. But I can see, oh, this one show has a crazy amount of web browser impressions, 90%. And then you ask, well, where are these coming from? Oh, we have this website that we drive paid traffic to. And it's like, okay, well, this is ridiculous. This is dumb. I'm not paying for this. It's not real people. It's just web traffic coming through. So yes, we can see some of it. Sometimes it's just hard to catch. And I think the sad reality is we are pumping out thousands and thousands of ads a month, and sometimes little things get missed. And in the grand ecosystem, brands are going through oftentimes big exchanges like the Trade Desk, et cetera, and their impressions are just showing up all over the place. And they don't necessarily get all the little incremental levels of visibility on everything. And it's easy to call it Big Short, AAA tranche, bad impressions with good impressions to make something feel good and inflated, which I think our industry has gotten away with for a long time, with packaging one really good show with a lot of really crappy impressions underneath.
Is there something we should be doing about the AI slop and the AI generated content that is just there to induce some clicks?
Probably two things. One, labeling is probably the first step of just being transparent about what is AI and what isn't. That has to come from the onus of the creators, because creators are going to be the ones that are going to have to check that box. It's going to get harder and harder for, say, Spotify or Apple to know what's AI and what's not AI when you're uploading it through their platforms. So we can't trust the platforms to do that. So transparency and honesty, probably at some level. I would hope that out of people. And then two, I think pivoting towards metrics that are more real, like a listen, will likely be a better compromise in the future to avoid shitty content from ruling our industry and ruling the ecosystem of podcast listening.
You've had some great advice out there, including when you go to a conference, maybe avoiding the after hours, events. That's very smart. I love that.
I've partaken every now and then, and I'll give a clause around this. If you are the type of person that can stay very stoic, or say sober lightly, not that you have to partake in anything for it to feel like a late night escapade, but look, when I first got into podcast advertising, I went to a podcast movement in Vegas. That was my first ever event. And I had come out of like a very religious upbringing. I went to a religious school. I was a sober person. I did not really partake in much at that point in my life. And I realized very quickly how easy people talk at conferences about things that are going on in their businesses, etc., and the amount of secrets that are spilled and the amount of shenanigans people will get into, and some of that can be really unhealthy. I think both from a personal perspective, I think you can get caught up in the wrong stuff, and that can have a damaging I don't know how I was going to phrase this, but I'm losing my connecting word. But I think people can get caught up in a lot of the mess, and it will damage their career for the long term of what kind of things and what kind of people you hang out with and do. The other piece, though, is I'll caveat some of the greatest learnings and conversations that I've ever had have been in those late night conversations. I was able to have a beautiful conversation with a handful of people at the lobby bar late into the evening after everything has passed off. I usually won't get in a car to go to the casino with people afterwards, but those late night evenings at the Podcast Movement Hotel where you're in the lobby and people maybe aren't the most right of mind about how they're talking and thinking, you'll sometimes hear things that will dramatically change your perspective on stuff, and people talk a little bit more freely about their ideas. So I'll caveat and say I've learned some of the most things that have been important to my career there. Be careful.
Yeah. Lobby bar is generally my trap. Right after dinner, I have to make a decision. Do I want to stop at the lobby bar, or do I want to keep going and get a good night's sleep?
Yeah. That is really the decision at Podcast Movement, isn't it?
You get one chance at this thing, and if you can make the right turn, or you can make the wrong turn. And I've made the right turn, and I've wound up with like these great deals the next morning, and 5 new podcasts are joining the network, and it's fantastic. And then I've also done some things like, what did we do again?
Yeah. I'll put it this way for anyone listening. It's like, you don't have to do the things to be a likable person in an industry. Just be you, be transparent, be honest, and show up. Don't judge people either. That's the other thing. Don't shame other people for doing their thing that they're going to do. Let them live their life. You're not their police. You're not their parents. Let them do whatever they want to do. Don't judge, show up, listen, and still be likable.
By the way, this shirt, that I'm wearing right now, it's a Saturday, and it's a t-shirt, and it's Winnipeg in October, but it's from Uniqlo.
I love Uniqlo.
I do too. How come you love Uniqlo?
I love their Supima cotton. It's like one of my favorite fitting t-shirts that I have. It's like I got a black one, and it's like perfectly fits me. And there's very few shirts that I ever wear that I feel like fit me well. I'm a weirdly proportioned person. I got a long torso, short legs, and so I often need like a large shirt for my length. But I'm like a narrower body, so I want a medium. And for whatever reason, the Supima Uniqlo shirt is perfect for me. It like fits so good.
So there are a lot of podcasters who are listening going, well, how do I become a part of this? How do I make it so that Adam knows that my podcast exists and maybe I would like some podcast ads in my show? Can they reach out to you? What do you recommend? What do you sort of look at as being baseline? Doesn't matter where they host. What are you looking for? What can they offer you in order to get your attention?
First off, I believe in just having a chat with anyone. I'm a pretty pro bono guy. If you want to have some conversation about your show and have some input from someone who's done some ad buying and hosted a show that monetized, I'm usually quite happy to have those conversations. In terms of our business, like our brands are mostly focused on US audiences. We're mostly doing host-read episodic stuff. We're not doing a lot of full catalog. We do a little bit for sure. In terms of volume of impressions, that makes it an easier entry point into a conversation with our brands, which are like generally quite national companies. So usually about 10,000 downloads an episode. There's some exceptions to that if you're a really niche show, especially in the health and wellness space. Like if you're a health expert and a smaller show, that's like, yes, reach out to me. We would love to work with you. If you're less than that, let me give you different advice, because I was much less than that. If you were a smaller show, don't go for Magic Spoon Cereal. Don't go for AG1. Don't go to Manscaped. Don't go to these big brands that you hear all the time on podcasts. You're just not big enough for them to put the time into your show to then onboard. The cost for them is greater than what the reward will be out of it. You want to find a brand that you can have a meaningful, sizable impact on, where they see you as a valuable asset to their company. So find a brand that's maybe on their way up, something that you find that you really want to support. Maybe it's something not super local, like your next door neighbor and their hand knitted crochet thing that they really only sell to a handful of people, but maybe something that's in the small to medium sized business range, doing $500,000 a year to $1 million a year. My first brand that I worked with was an independent coffee company called Onyx Coffee Lab. They are now like quite big, but at the time that I was working with them, they were like still coming up in the ranks as a coffee brand, and I got to have a somewhat meaningful impact on their business early on. I knew my rep by name. I would get on calls with her, and she was lovely to talk to. And I think you want to know that you're meaningful to them. And if you want to know if you're meaningful to them, how willing are they to get on a phone call with you to talk about what you're doing with them? The less likely they're willing to get on a call or email back with you, you're probably not big enough for it to be that impactful to their business. And that might be a good gauge to use to know if that's the right brand you should be working with.
How do you take your coffee?
Almost black always. I'm a pour over guy in the morning. I have been for a long time. If I'm camping, it's an AeroPress. Happy to divulge my recipes. I got a decent pour over recipe I like. Sometimes I'll do a little pour over ice and make a little iced coffee in the morning. I got a lot that I do, but I'm not a milk in my coffee guy. I will on occasion at a cafe do a oat milk latte.
Well, one of the things I really like about speaking with you and meeting you for the first time in Calgary was your passion for ad buying and podcasting. My experience and having dealt with many ad buyers is that they've got so many other things on the go. They don't really pay attention to podcasting. They have wrong information. They don't really know the space that well. You clearly do. And so I really thank you for taking the time to explain this to a lot of people. And it was great meeting you in Calgary. And we're going to have you back on the show again soon.
Oh, thanks so much, Matt. It's always a joy. And I don't know, I got into a late night obsession with reading articles after 9 o'clock. And so I don't know, I care.
The Sound Off Podcast is written and hosted by Matt Kundle. Produced by Evan Serminski. Edited by Chloe Emo Lane. Social media by Aiden Glassy. Another great creation from the Sound Off Media Company. There's always more at soundoffpodcast.com.